Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to you all. My name is Janice Katz. I'm the curator for Japanese art here at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I am delighted to see this great turnout for this much anticipated lecture in conjunction with our current exhibition of Japanese prints by contemporary women artists after 1950. That exhibition is in Gallery 107, entitled A Sign of Things to Come. And if you haven't seen that already, or the exhibition Radical Clay, that focuses on ceramic art by women in the contemporary period, all the galleries in the museum will be open until 8 o'clock tonight. Dr. Jeannie Kenmotsu, who is the Arlene and Harold Schnitzer Curator of Asian Art at the Portland Art Museum, has done thorough research into tonight's topic and has a deep knowledge of these artists and their works. Late next year in Portland, I just learned, she'll have a major show of one of the artists featured tonight, Yoshida Chizuko. And she's the organizer of that exhibition, and she'll be publishing a catalog on the exhibition as well. In addition to her interest in contemporary art, Dr. Kenmotsu is a specialist in the art of early modern Japan, with a focus on painting, illustrated books, and prints. And as we begin tonight, a reminder to please silence your mobile devices. So with that, please help me welcome Dr. Kenmotsu, who tonight will be presenting Seen and Unseen, Japan's Post-War Women Printmakers.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I am thrilled to be speaking here today at the Art Institute of Chicago. Before I begin, I want to express my thanks to my wonderful colleague, Janice Katz, for the kind invitation, and to Mel Agarie and Frances McMahon Ward for making all the arrangements for my visit. And I'd also like to thank our captioner, Kathy, and everyone behind the scenes running these programs and events. It is thanks to them that we get to do things like this. In the wake of the Pacific War, Japanese printmaking experienced a huge post-war boom. This dynamic new energy was fueled by international encounters, new art galleries and dealers, and English language publications. At the same time, a younger generation of artists was introduced to the medium. These men and women joined the ranks of established printmakers, first as mentees and then as peers. Alongside woodblock printing, an art form that had flourished since the 17th century, they explored and fostered techniques newer to Japan, such as lithography and different intaglio techniques of engraving, etching, mezzotint, and aquatint. This creative expansion found a ready and willing audience among foreign collectors. My focus today will be on women artists drawn to the expressive potential of the medium in the 1950s and 60s. These artists have been both seen and unseen. Recognized for their contributions and creativity early on, they forged successful careers as professional artists, even as they faced sexism and a patriarchal art system designed to support the careers of men. Today, their work is held in major museum collections worldwide, from Chicago to Portland to places like the British Museum abroad. But serious study of these artists has been severely limited, to the extent that much of their work has languished in print vaults across the world. The relative invisibility of their work in institutional collections and the historical void into which they have faded means that for most of the general public, their stories remain unknown. Today's talk will introduce a few of these artists and bring to light some of the lesser-known aspects of their artistic output. The 1950s and 60s in Japan was a time when printmaking thrived as an art form. The period was dominated by contemporary artists of the Sosaku Hanga, or creative print movement, which had begun several decades prior in the early 20th century. The movement was largely focused on the woodblock print medium, in which a block of wood is carved in relief to print only the raised areas. Artists of the Sosaku Hanga movement championed the vision, labor, and genius of the individual artist. This was a stark contrast to traditional Japanese printmaking models, where a collaborative team of print designer, carver, and printer were orchestrated by a publisher. This lovely print is a humorous illustration of the publishing industry as early as 250 years earlier in Japan. Here, the artist Kitagawa Utamaro depicts the scene you might have found in an early 19th century workshop. But in place of the male craftsmen who performed these jobs, he has composed a scene of beautiful women hard at work. In the center sheet of this triptych, women carve woodblocks and sharpen their carving tools. At left, they apply sizing to the blank sheets of paper and hang them to dry. And at right, the publisher, who is dressed in an elegant black kimono, scrutinizes a fresh design while an artist looks on anxiously and an assistant brings tea. Utamaro's composition was appreciated in the period for its gender-bending qualities, but today it clarifies for us the typical division of labor that went into the making of Japanese prints for over 200 years. The 20th century creative print movement was built on a different credo. Jiga, jikoku, jizuri, or self-designed, self-carved, self-printed, was the rallying cry. This was more a rhetorical stance than a description strictly of the actual process, for many artists still worked with block carvers or printers. But the ethos of the movement was that the artist was complete in himself, and it reflected an effort to self-consciously distance creative print artists from the publisher-led model that we just saw. These were printmakers who maintained that artistic consciousness and the individual creative intentions of the artist were paramount. In the post-war years, artists emerging from the creative print movement found an enthusiastic foreign reception for their work, first with American occupation forces and later abroad in international biennials and museum exhibitions. Then, as now, stars of the movement were men like Onchi Koshiro, Munakata Shiko, Sekino Junichiro, and Saito Kiyoshi. Although they have received far less attention than these male counterparts, there were in fact many women printmakers active during this period. In Japan at present, probably the most well-known of these female artists is Shinoda Toko. Born in 1913, Shinoda was raised practicing calligraphy from the age of 5 years old. By 1940, she had begun to earn recognition as a calligrapher, poet, and painter. The outbreak of World War II temporarily interrupted her artistic practice, not only because of the adversities of civilian life during a time of national mobilization, but also due to the difficulty of continuing to exhibit her work as an unmarried young woman at a time when marriage and childbirth were considered patriotic acts to support the war effort. She returned to making art in 1947, and about a decade later left Japan for the United States. Shinoda spent 2 decisive years in New York, where the photograph on the left was taken in 1957. There she had exhibitions at the Betty Parsons Gallery and Bertha Schaefer Gallery, and she met a number of famous abstract expressionist painters in the orbit of Betty Parsons, one of the most important American art dealers in avant-garde art. Some contemporary critics observed the synergy between Shinoda's modernist calligraphy and the gestural paintings of American men like Jackson Pollock, Clifford Still, and Franz Kline. Other critics dismissed any possibility of Asian influence on abstract expressionism, or indeed any shared commonality between American painters and Asian artists like Shinoda. Still, her abstract paintings continued to be shown in New York in the 1960s and 70s, and although her status at home as an avant-garde calligrapher was well established before she left Japan, her time in New York catapulted her reputation after her return in 1958. These continuing New York exhibitions cemented her professional identity, as not only a female calligrapher, but also, and this is a critical distinction, as an international artist. In 1960, she began to study lithography with the American Arthur Flory, who introduced the medium to numerous young printmakers in Tokyo at this time, and printed many of their works. In lithography, an image is drawn directly upon flat, smooth stones or prepared metal plates. The appeal of this printing process for someone like Shinoda no doubt lay in its ability to convey the hand of the artist, to translate the movement of the body, the dryness or wetness of the ink, the pressure applied to the brush. Indeed, Shinoda's paintings and prints share a unified visual language, using the basic materials of ink and brush as a foundational starting point. Her artistic practice over many decades mined the tonal and textural qualities of ink, something calligraphers in East Asia have explored for millennia and contemporary ink artists today continue to grapple with. Some compositions incorporated gold or silver foil or metallic leaf, and red ink made from cinnabar often appears in small details. Over time, pure gestural abstraction began to feature more prominently in her work, although the lexical quality of calligraphy as a visual form of language never fully disappeared entirely. Like many women artists in Japan, Shinoda faced sexist, even misogynist criticism within the hierarchical Japanese art world. Her triumphs abroad offered some degree of insulation from the patriarchal structures that typically determined an artist's degree of commercial and professional success. However, the equivocation, indifference, or even hostility that she did face may have also shaped her fiercely independent attitude and the way she talked about herself and her work throughout her life. In 2015, she published a memoir titled Things That I Understood About Life by Age 103. Life is fun, even when you are alone. In it, she stated, quote, I am an artist, but I never thought to become an artist. I feel like I became an artist while trying to live a life of freedom. My heart's yearning for freedom has created my own path, unquote. In 2021, Shinoda passed away at the age of 107, after 80 years of making art and pursuing a resolutely independent path as an artist. She is only recently beginning to receive well-deserved scholarly attention that grapples with the tension between her ardent individualism and the need to situate her work relationally to both the Japanese art world and the international art scene. It's also worth pointing out that because Shinoda's chosen printmaking medium was lithography, she is sometimes excluded from critical discussions of the 20th century print in Japan. This exclusion has historical roots in the discourse around modern printmaking and its international promotion to the West in the period, which privileged the woodblock print as a quintessentially Japanese art form. In particular, English language publications were crucial to defining the genre of modern Japanese prints for Westerners in the 1950s and 60s, and likely played an outsized role in how these prints were received by Anglophone readers. The pioneering work was Oliver Statler's The Modern Japanese Print and Art Reborn. This bestseller created a canon of the modern Japanese print, at least among Americans, beginning with its publication in June of 1956 and continuing with its many successive print runs over the next 2 decades. Also influential was the work of James Michener, the novelist. Michener was a print collector himself and provided advice and support for Statler's project. In 1959, Michener inaugurated a competition of modern Japanese prints, evaluated by 2 separate juries in Tokyo and New York City. Original prints by the 10 winning artists were tipped into this deluxe book, titled The Modern Japanese Print, an oversized, very heavy limited edition housed in a wooden slipcase. Alongside each of the original prints, Michener provided a lengthy commentary on each artist and the work selected. A popular edition followed in 1968, and that book is in libraries everywhere today. Like Statler, Michener positioned modern graphic arts in Japan as the inheritor of Japan's woodblock printing tradition. Both books had a profound effect on private and institutional collecting in the United States. Nearly a decade later, in 1967, contemporary Japanese printmaking was the first major post-war English language survey written from a Japanese perspective. The book was compiled by Kawakita Michiaki, then the vice director of the National Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo. It was more expansive in the number of artists and range of printmaking styles it presented, but the book likewise failed to offer gender parity. And I don't want to belabor any points that may be obvious, but I went through these books to do a rough tally of the numbers. Statler's book contains 100 illustrations. Only 2 of those illustrations is by female artists, and they happen to be from the same family. In Michener's deluxe book, of the 10 winning artists profiled, 2 were women artists. And in Kawakita's survey of 119 artists, only 14 were women. So, what initially American servicemen and their families, and later tourists, were taught to collect was informed by a fairly specific and gendered set of preferences. In lockstep with these publications, galleries, critics, press, and collectors overwhelmingly supported the careers of male artists. In many respects, these attitudes reflected the conservatism and patriarchy of the Japanese art establishment at the time. Certainly, women's education was making progress, and social reforms were taking place. For instance, women were granted the right to vote in 1947. However, institutional barriers prevented an entire generation or more of talented female artists from accessing the education and support open to men. For example, women were forbidden to enroll at the Tokyo University of the Arts, the most prestigious art school in the country, until 1946. Therefore, most of the young women artists emerging in the 1950s were the same women who would have been barred from most arts institutions at precisely the most important years of higher level training. Things were changing, but not overnight. For instance, the long-standing Japan Print Association had nominated at least 10 female full or provisional members by 1959, but they were woefully outnumbered by more than 200 men. Institutional privileges like these mattered for many reasons. They fostered opportunities for specialized training and access to mentors, and created spaces for deeper social and creative bonds among young artists. But they also mattered because institutional belonging has been significant for the professional artist in Japan since at least the beginning of the 20th century. Art societies, for example, offered a peer network, but they were also the most critical vehicle for exhibition and for publicity, the way to be noticed by critics, dealers, collectors, curators, other artists, and the public. In other words, art societies provided the vital infrastructure for professional artists in Japan. Within this environment emerged Japan's first printmaking society for women artists, the Joryu Hanga Kyokai, or the Women's Print Association. This red invitation card advertised the first exhibition of the Women's Print Association in 1956. By this time, several of the group's founding members, such as Shinoda Toko, Yoshida Chizuko, Iwami Reika, and Kobayashi Donge, were among the few women already admitted to prestigious associations, and they were beginning to show their work regularly in the premier group exhibitions in Japan, such as the large annual shows of the Japan Print Association. This was certainly a good foot in the door. However, the very existence of the Women's Print Association speaks to the very real need for its formation. Despite considerable gains in the art world of the time, the women you see pictured here have never attained the level of fame of their celebrated male peers, some of whom were their own husbands. As you can see, the artists of the Women's Print Association were not united by a shared visual aesthetic or even the same printmaking medium. Instead, this was a collective that provided infrastructure and professional support, as well as a crucial venue for talented female printmakers to present their work in consistent annual exhibitions. Nor was this endeavor short-lived. The Women's Print Association held exhibitions for a decade, from 1956 to 1965, and grew to encompass 26 members. One of the founders of the Women's Print Association was Iwami Reika. Today, her prints are found widely in North American museums and private collections, making her one of the better-known women printmakers of her generation. Here you see her at what I believe is the first Joryu Hanga Kyokai exhibition in 1956. At left is one of her rare early prints in which she has already begun to explore effects of wood grain, shadow, and gradation within a restricted palette of dark ink tones, rich red, and a highlight color. Here, a golden kind of yellow. Her earliest prints are among her most abstract, and you can see the affinity between this example from the Art Institute and the prints on display in the historical photograph. Iwami's later style would become her signature. She is known for these monochrome, highly textured compositions that bring out the character of the wood grain, punctuated by details of gold and silver foil that create bright, luminous highlights. These prints were made in the 60s and 70s, by which time Iwami had already achieved a distinct clarity of vision in her practice. Like Shinoda Toko, Iwami never married or had children, and her long and productive career in printmaking lasted for well more than half a century. When Iwami discovered woodblock printmaking in 1954, she was actually training in a different field as a doll maker. She was apprenticed to Hori Ryujo, a master of traditional Japanese doll carving, who also holds the distinction of being the first woman to be designated a living national treasure in 1955. This doll you see at left was given directly by the artist to Alison Tolman, who is now a second-generation dealer in modern Japanese prints, but when she was growing up, developed close bonds with the young artist Iwami Reika. This doll is named Sarubia or Salvia, and as far as I'm aware, unique in that it may be the only surviving example of Iwami's doll carving practice. It bears a marked resemblance to the dolls carved in the 1950s by her teacher, Hori Ryujo, with an elegant but robust abstraction of the body, a slender, simplified head, voluminous robes on a wide base, and delicately painted eyes. Dated to 1963, it would have been made after Iwami's career as a print artist was well established, and it suggests that the turn from one medium to the other was not a sharp break, as is typically supposed. Visual similarities might also be observed in Iwami's early abstract prints, as you see here on the right, such as the swooping seraph-like curves, a salvia-like red palette, and the liberal use of mica. Iwami benefited from the early support of one of the biggest ambassadors for Japanese prints, James Michener. She was one of the 2 women selected for his deluxe book, in which he calls her, quote, the first woman in the history of Japanese prints to attain full stature, unquote. Michener admired in Iwami what he called her mastery of texture and color. And yet, even as he praised her work, he took credit for discovering her. Quote, I can recall the day on which I was passing an art store in Tokyo and saw a copy of the first print Miss Iwami was offering to the public. At the time, I suppose the artist was another of the gifted young men who were knocking for admission to the ateliers of critical review, and I remember thinking, that one might make it. But as I was about to pass by, I stopped to restudy the beautiful use of texture which characterized this unknown print, its vivid yet controlled coloring, and its wholly satisfying composition. I concluded then that this Iwami, whoever he was, had reached a point rather more advanced than competing artists who were just appearing on the scene, unquote. So Michener then goes into the shop and buys 3 prints by this unknown artist, who at this point he still mistakes for a man. Later, he discovers it was, in fact, a woman. He says, quote, at big shows, I began to spot her work, and it maintained its high standards. She was on her way, and I felt an inward glow of satisfaction, unquote. For many readers, this was their first introduction to Iwami Reika. I've quoted Michener here at some length because it reveals the discourse surrounding these artists in the period. Michener is perhaps justifiably smug for having recognized her talent, certainly, but his claim to have discovered her is a bit overblown. Iwami trained with Onchi Koshiro, one of the most prominent Sosaku Hanga artists of the day, and she would have met other artists while studying with Onchi and at the Bunka Gakuin Art School in Tokyo, where many other women artists trained. In fact, by the time Michener's book was published, Iwami was already exhibiting prints with the Women's Print Association and elsewhere. Nevertheless, English language publications made Japanese prints accessible to a new foreign audience, primarily North American, but also the UK, Australia, and elsewhere. Books could be learning tools for the armchair traveler, opening up a market for prints to those who had never even stepped foot in Japan. Arguably, Statler's and Michener's early books were the most influential, but other books were also popular. In 1949, the Japan Travel Bureau published a revised English edition by scholar Fujikaka Shizuya, who did a sweeping study of Japanese woodblock prints in their popular tourist library series, and it covered the 11th century up to the creative print movement. In the 1960s, the artists Yoshida Toshi and Azechi Umetaro published English language books that focused on more technical aspects of their craft. And Americans Ronald Robertson, with his contemporary printmaking in Japan, and Francis Blakemore's Who's Who in Modern Japanese Prints, updated and expanded on the reference-like nature of Oliver Statler's book. All of these publications advanced the field and widened public appreciation for modern Japanese printmakers. Unfortunately, very few women were selected for any of the major entries or essays. One such artist who appears in a huge range of publications, but often as a kind of supporting character, was Yoshida Chizuko. Chizuko was one of the more well-connected and in some ways most established of the members of the Women's Print Association. She married into the Yoshida family of artists, headed until his death by Yoshida Hiroshi, the great printmaker of the early 20th century. Hiroshi's sons, Toshi and Hodaka, had followed in his footsteps, and their mother, Fujio, was also an accomplished artist. Prints were truly the family business. From here forward, I'll refer to Yoshida family artists by their personal name to avoid confusion. Chizuko had been working primarily in oil painting at the time of her marriage to Hodaka, and she is acknowledged within the family as the most avant-garde. Oliver Statler described her as, quote, slim, pert, and vivacious, unquote. Make of that what you will. But he acknowledged her talent and pointed to some of her musical influences. Jazz, one of her earliest finished prints, reveals her love of music. Repetitive lines, circles, and zigzags layered in a joyfully frenetic composition suggest a meditation on the experience of sound. It also prefigures her later work with bold colors and a strong sense of pictorial composition, which you can also see a bit in the print she's handling in her studio here on the right. This portrait of Chizuko comes from a photo essay in the 1960s about the Women's Print Association. The images all have the flavor of deliberately staged action shots of the artists either in the studio or choosing prints for exhibition. No doubt they were happy to have the press coverage, but this article was also very much a product of its time. In one caption, the writer calls them Mama-san Hangaka, or what we might translate as mommy printmakers. Chizuko did indeed have a family with small children to care for, but for me, that description is so at odds with the form of self-presentation Chizuko gives us in the studio. She was no stranger to the camera, both in front of the lens and behind it. The seriousness of purpose conveyed by her erect posture, thoughtful gaze, and the messy work of printmaking scattered around her is totally undercut by this kind of language and framing, however well-intentioned. Such challenges are probably one of the reasons she was motivated to help found the Women's Print Association, despite the long printmaking pedigree of the Yoshida family. These two works are typical of her earliest forays in printmaking, small in size but full of energy and movement, with an exuberant sense of form and color. Spring shows the influence of her teacher Kitaoka Fumio, who also used string and plywood in combination with more traditional woodblock printing techniques. Within a few years, this kind of abstraction would be further pared down, even as the scale of her prints grew larger. A number of prints from the late 1950s through the 60s drew inspiration from her travels abroad. In 1957 and 58, she and Hodaka embarked with his mother Fujio on a kind of working honeymoon and traveled all around the world. Chizuko was especially struck by the desert in Arizona, a kind of alien landscape she had never before seen. The print on the right is named after Jama Masjid in Delhi, one of the largest mosques in India, which they also visited. Like her friend Iwami Reika, Chizuko would go on to make prints for decades. These embossed prints were produced in the years relatively soon after the dissolution of the Women's Print Association in 1965, but they indicate some of the range and changes in Chizuko's practice. Two are photographed here in raking light, so you can see the deep patterns created by blind embossing in the paper. Certainly, op art and minimalism are being explored in these works, but there's still a reference to landscape and the observable world. The intense hues and graphic sensibility of these prints anticipate some of the work she would go on to do in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. However, she would eventually shift away from the minimalism of these pared-down compositions in favor of lyrical but still striking images that were created using a combination of woodblock printing and zinc plate photo etching. Around the time of Chizuko and Hodaka's marriage in 1953, another woman in the Yoshida family began to take up abstract printmaking. Chizuko's mother-in-law, Fujio, was a highly skilled painter, and although she had designed a small number of prints in the 1920s, these prints reproduced completed paintings, mostly still lifes of flowers in vases. In fact, prints were never central to Fujio's practice. She was a talented and well-trained draftsman, and the majority of her work over her lifetime was executed in watercolor, perhaps because prints and oil painting were more the reserve of her husband, Hiroshi. Although Fujio had rare early commercial and critical success as a female artist in the Taiheiyo and state-sponsored Bunten exhibitions, she became closely linked with the Shiokai, or Vermilion Leaf Society, a newly established painting society exclusively for women. Perhaps it attracted Fujio because the organization raised the profile and visibility of female artists, a value she shared with her future daughter-in-law, Chizuko. Beginning in 1920, Fujio exhibited paintings almost every year in the annual exhibitions of Shiokai for the next 60 years. Shortly before her husband Hiroshi's death in 1950, Fujio seems to have been freed from some of the artistic tenets propounded by the head of the Yoshida family for so long. In particular, a fidelity to realism as the highest or only way of making pictures. It is believed her earliest experiments in abstraction date to 1949, when Fujio was already in her 60s. They consist of large oil paintings depicting an intimate, close-up view of the interior of flowers. This series was a radical departure from the academic training of her youth, which had been closely supervised by her husband Hiroshi, and from the watercolors she had produced throughout her life. Swirling, elegant, and sensual, each canvas exults in the flowing, organic movement of a flower's inner petals. In 1953, Fujio took up printmaking again, this time basing her woodblock prints on her abstract paintings and carving the blocks for at least some designs by herself. The bold fields of color and fluid shapes lent themselves well to this second medium. And although Fujio never produced very many designs, her flower prints are quite captivating and powerful. Fujio was undoubtedly one of the pioneering artists of her generation, and her legacy is slowly becoming better understood in Japan and abroad. The Yoshida family legacy also lives on quite literally in the work of Chizuko's only daughter and Fujio's granddaughter, Yoshida Ayomi. Ayomi studied architecture at university, intending to pursue her own independent path. Nevertheless, surrounded by blocks, carving, and inking since birth, perhaps she was always destined to become a printmaker. But it was not until a screen printing residency in Mendocino, California in 1979 that she began to make her own woodblock prints. Her work is more conceptual than other members of her family, focused on process and the traces of her own repetitive action in carving tiny gouges into the surface of the wood. The Touches series is named for this very practice, the touching of chisel to block over and over and over, with each visually stunning composition titled for the colors used to print the work, such as magenta, carmine, and carmine again, as you see here on the right, or here on the left, carmine, violet, and blue. In contrast, the Surface series, as you see on the right, explored the effects of light on water. Surface KI3 captures the section of the Kanda River at Inokashira Park in northeastern Tokyo, near the family home where Ayomi grew up. Printed in a series of specific color variations, this series is a masterful expression of Ayomi's technical facility as a printmaker and her ability to capture the ever-changing appearance of flowing water. In recent years, Ayomi has focused on large-scale installations involving washi, or handmade Japanese paper, and in fact, a new work just debuted a couple of weeks ago at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. She has also returned to making woodblock prints that focus on the theme of water. Her Rain series of the last several years involves large sheets of paper printed with saturated hues of indigo in many successive layers, creating an immersive, almost sensorial effect. Returning now to artists who took up printmaking in the 50s and 60s, Oda Mayumi also moved abroad as a young woman, like Shinoda Toko. Born in 1941, Oda represents a younger generation. Still shadowed by the legacies of war, having survived the firebombing of Tokyo at the age of 3, Oda nevertheless grew up in a more progressive era in Japan. For instance, she was able to enroll as a female student at the Tokyo University of the Arts, something impossible for the generation before her. While still a student at university, she married the American translator Jonathan Nathan, and in 1966 they moved to New York. She describes those early years as an amazing time to be in the New York scene, and was as profoundly affected by the atmosphere of literary beatniks and political movements as by artists she met, like Mark Rothko and Willem de Kooning. Around this time, Oda began what she calls her quest for goddesses. Beginning in etching, she drew and printed large-breasted female figures, such as primordial mother goddess figures like Gaia. Her exuberant palette and almost fauvist expressive style have garnered comparisons to Matisse, but Oda's female figures, often nude or partially nude, have a clearly personal and intimate quality that approaches self-portraiture. In fact, by 1970, as a young mother, Oda turned even more passionately toward art as a means to preserve her sense of self. She has said, quote, "Between taking care of 2 children in the house, I had very little time to create. I felt like I was going to lose myself. Out of desperation, my art became a survival force. Through creating goddesses, I became stronger. Goddesses are projections of myself and who I want to be," unquote. In 1968, Oda began making screen prints. She found silkscreen printmaking familiar for its affinities with her training in fabric dyeing at university, where she had majored in textiles. She also loved the freedom it afforded for exploring color. A number of works draw inspiration from earlier Japanese art. Ukiyo-e artists like Haranobu and Hokusai offered models for thinking about polychrome printing, as well as multi-sheet diptychs and triptychs to create larger compositions. Further inspiration came from the rimpa style of Japanese painting. Goddess in Autumn displays the stimulating effect of both influences. It references ukiyo-e in its use of outline, flattened composition, and bold color, while it also celebrates the patterning and fluid line of 17th century rimpa artists like Tawaraya Sotatsu and Ogata Korin. Oda's silkscreen techniques also uses traditional materials of Japanese art, such as animal hide glue, and she mixes ink to achieve a more transparent watercolor-like effect, printed on Japanese kozo or mulberry paper, which gives an appearance much closer to a woodblock print. Today, Oda is best known for her several series of painting and prints featuring goddesses, but other female archetypes also proliferate. The Temptress series consists of 5 portraits of what she calls women who, quote, turned the world upside down in some way, unquote. Featuring Helen of Troy, Yang Guifei, Cleopatra, Eve, and the Japanese goddess Ama no Uzume. All are drawn from different legends of world culture. Meaningfully, Oda omits the male figures associated with these legendary beauties. Helen of Troy, for example, stands in a powerful pose, as if beckoning or guiding ships across the Aegean Sea between Sparta and Troy. Yang Guifei, the treasured consort of 8th century Emperor Xuanzang, inspired more than a millennia of art and literature. Oda pictures her here in the style of a portrait bust, a kind of heroine of her own tale. This is a spare scene, stripped to its essentials. The Weeping Willow recalls a famous line from poet Bai Juyi's Song of Everlasting Sorrow. And in the sky, 2 phoenixes soar among scalloped clouds that spill beyond the picture frame into the margins. A pair of phoenixes typically symbolize an auspicious marriage in Chinese art, but here allude to the ill-fated romance between Yang and the emperor. Yet rather than highlight her tragic end, Oda Mayumi has sought to portray elements of Yang's strength and everlasting sway on the cultural imagination. In closing, modern printmaking was emerging as a distinct and exciting field in the 1950s and 60s, as much for women as men. Even if that field was being shaped in highly gendered terms, these female printmakers found in this medium a generative space of creativity, inspiration, and solidarity. Importantly, some of their significant early successes are beginning to gain greater recognition. For example, the rediscovery of the Joryu Hanga Kyokai, or Women's Print Association, has opened up a new inventory of overlooked artists and historic exhibitions well known in the period, but for decades largely unseen. Rediscoveries like these lead to capacious new avenues for research, and exhibitions like A Sign of Things to Come, currently on view at the Art Institute, bring these beautiful and moving works of art back into the public eye. I feel strongly that we need these kinds of stories, which teach us not only about the resiliency and imagination of artists, but historical lessons about the value of women's work and the ability of women to be autonomous, fiercely creative individuals. I hope this evening's program has piqued your interest in these remarkable women artists who pursued the graphic arts with enormous talent, skill, and inventiveness, even while the art establishment and the engines of scholarship, popular publishing, and the press put them on unequal footing. Bringing to light forgotten aspects of their work helps to expand not only the history of modern Japanese printmaking, but also the participation of women artists in the international landscape of the post-war years, and above all, the seen and unseen stories which merit our closer attention. Thank you very much. I think we have time for some questions. I'm told to make an announcement to please raise your hand, and staff will bring a microphone to you so we can all hear.
Hello. To what extent were these prints on display, or how many prints were commonly made? If the women were not really celebrated, was it mostly just in their family homes, or where would people have maybe seen their art on display?
Yeah, so you're asking about display, not about print runs, right?
Both. Both. I guess I'm curious about how much dissemination there was, if the men's prints were so much more popular, they're written about in books and they were more celebrated. I'm sure they were in galleries a lot more. And so what about the women's work? How was it shared, if at all, or was it mostly just in their local groups? Or I guess that relates to the idea of print runs. Did they just do a few, or was it larger runs? Just kind of curious about that.
Well, to take the latter part first, I don't think that edition sizes were really determined for either men or women, except for very, very popular subjects. I know that Chizuko, for example, later in her life would do, earlier in her life, she might have done a series of butterfly prints and it was 20 or 30. And later in her life, it might be 70 or 100 because they knew they would sell. But otherwise, that wasn't really in play. In the 50s and 60s, they were showing. They were showing a lot. They were showing at the Nihon Hanga Kyokai, the Japan Print Association, which was kind of the premier group, big show. The Joryu Hanga Kyokai, the Women's Print Association, had really consistent shows. They had more than one a year, but they definitely had a kind of big one each year. They also had shows in New York, Honolulu, and DC during that period. So they were known. I mean, I can find all of these newspaper articles. The critics were going, they were seeing them, they were publishing images of them in the newspaper, and they just didn't quite make it into the kind of premier publications and the things that were really going out to support a lot of the artists. Because, Statler and Michener, just to take two easy examples, I mean, they were friends with a lot of these artists. Some of those projects came from a place of real goodwill and a desire to really promote the artists. They just didn't promote the women. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for this lecture. I am really curious if there's anything more you could say about the Touches series by Yoshida Ayomi, in particular the process. I've been obsessing over them a little bit because they seem to really wear the process on the sleeve. You can see like the individual carving marks and the different layers, but when I try and track like what each reduction must have looked like, I can't do it at all. And so you may not know how she did them specifically, but.
Well, I know for some, I think the color Touches series and Surface, the ones from the 80s where she's using a lot of color, it's a little harder to index exactly what the process might have looked like. And I haven't seen any of the blocks from that period, but she has some slightly later prints that are monochrome, where she basically prints in black and holds white in reserve, where all the white marks are, places where she's gouged. And so everything is this minuscule, kind of touch on the block. And she said, one of the things she's told me is that it's really, really difficult, in part because, each of those instances of touching the block, you have to control the depth really carefully because of the thinness of, the type of paper and the kinds of inks that she's using to print. It's really easy for things to get into those grooves, which she doesn't want. So the level of kind of physical control, she says, is, the process for her is in many ways the largest part of the artwork, rather than the finished product that we all admire in the galleries or on walls. And then it's that much more complicated when she's printing in color and getting these incredible kinds of variations with just 2 or 3 colors. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering, what do they do with the blocks after they're finished? Because there could be limited editions or numbered, or sometimes if she did 20 or something, is it because they wear out or they don't think it's popular? But I would think that the block print itself, the block carvings themselves are art, because each one is one color in many of the old block prints. And thank you very much for this presentation, by the way.
Thank you. So if the question's about what happens to the blocks afterwards, so they don't wear out. And that's also a kind of a common misnomer with ukiyo-e prints, earlier prints as well. We think that, that maybe they stop making them because they wear out, and you do see the degradation with ukiyo-e over time for really, really popular print series. 36 Views of Mount Fuji, Hiroshige's big series. But we also think you can print at least hundreds, possibly thousands from that really, good cherry wood that they were using. In some cases, what happened is blocks would be reused. They could be replaned and reused. You'll often, when you see wood blocks, they're carved on both sides. I mean, materials being one of the most expensive components, certainly early in Japanese printmaking history. Another thing that happened is, Japanese architecture for a very long time has been, wood has been the primary material, which is very flammable. And we know that the city of Edo, now Tokyo, burned many times prior to the 20th century. And then in the 20th century, 2/3 of Tokyo was firebombed during World War II. So that doesn't answer the question about work from the 1950s, but that is one reason why we don't have a lot of older wood blocks around. For some of these artists, it's variable. Usually print runs were not limited by the block wearing out. However, there are some exceptions. So they're getting more experimental in this period. And Chizuko, for example, I mentioned that she used things like string or lace or netting. She would also use basically paper blocks, cutting paper and applying that to kind of build her matrix to print from. And that would wear out very quickly. And you could only print maybe one, maybe 2 or 3 prints before what you were working with just really would fall apart. So there's some variation. I have seen some blocks, but for example, I've seen some of Chizuko's blocks, but it's for works that were really exceptional. Like I'm thinking of one that is a diptych that's almost as high as I am and about 3 times as wide. And so I think that was one where I'm not sure what the later intention was or if it was just kind of a spectacular, printing matrix that she wanted to keep around or had other plans for. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. See one in the front on the right. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much for the beautiful lecture. So one thing I found striking is how the printing society was really more about support and maybe less like influencing styles. And I think that's kind of unique maybe, and just wanted to think a little bit more about that, if it's like them asserting their independence, a little bit, or creative style, like in their own ways, not really looking for that kind of influence, but more just support, and just was wondering if that interpretation spoke to you or what you think about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for bringing that up. I think they partly had models for this. It's not entirely unique in Japan. We talk about Sosaku Hanga, or the creative print movement today, like it was this really cohesive, movement of a small group of men who all worked in woodblock. That's not true. Actually, it had a kind of wider set of printmaking, materials in the beginning, and was kind of a looser collection. A lot of these societies get formed in part to kind of, bring order to chaos, perhaps, and also to kind of create exhibition opportunities. I mean, I talked about kind of established, art societies, but we're also talking about the medium of print, not painting. And there is certainly a hierarchy of Japanese art that's kind of been in play for a really long time. So there was some of that element. And so I think with the Joryu Hanga Kyokai, the group that started in 1956, I think they recognized that even if some of them were working in etching and others in woodblock and others experimenting with other things, that they still had a lot to offer each other. They, some of the guest books that they would have at the, you'd go to the reception or you'd go during the run of the show, you see a lot of names in there. I mean, tons of names, especially in the first couple of exhibitions. Michel Tapie is in there, Michener's in there, Statler goes. So I know that they saw these shows. I know that they were well known. And I think that was part of the objective. and maybe one of the reasons why they kept those books around after the fact. So it really was kind of an organizing principle, I think. Thank you.
Jeannie, thank you so much for your talk today.
Thank you all for coming.